The soft hum of rain fell gently over Willow Creek, a quiet town tucked in the forests of Oregon. It was the kind of late spring afternoon where time moved slowly, and everything felt wrapped in peace. Inside a small blue cottage at the edge of Copperbend River, Margaret Langley, a 65-year-old widow, cradled a warm mug of chamomile tea. Her porch smelled faintly of pine and rain, and the world felt still. A golden retriever-shaped garden statue stood next to a potted fern, a tribute to the dog she lost years ago. Inside the house, silence hung like an old, comfortable sweater until it shattered. A scream. High-pitched. Frantic. Young. Grandma. The mug slipped from Margaret's hands. It shattered on the floorboards, shards scattering like her thoughts. She ran. Her slippers slapped the wooden steps as she rushed toward the source. The scream had come from Ellie, her 6-year-old granddaughter, who had been playing near the back fence just moments ago. As Margaret rounded the garden fence, the world changed. The peaceful Copperbend River, usually just a lazy stream behind the property, had become an angry, churning monster. Weeks of rain had finally overwhelmed it. Trees swayed in protest. The soil had given way, and the river now cut deeper, wider, and faster. And clinging to a fallen tree trunk in the middle of the current was Ellie. Her little yellow raincoat stood out against the gray flood like a candle in the dark. Her fingers gripped bark slick with rain, and her tiny legs kicked wildly against the pull of the water. Every wave slapped against her face, her body, her life. Margaret stopped at the riverbank, breath stolen from her lungs. She couldn't scream. Couldn't move. Her heart seized. This was the moment every grandparent feared. And then, she heard it. Snap. A sharp, metallic crack. Like a chain tearing free. A blur of motion. Black and bronze fur streaked past her peripheral vision. Shadow. The German Shepherd. The dog no one trusted. The one townsfolk called dangerous. The one Margaret had chained behind the house out of caution, because that's what everyone had told her to do. Without a word, without a command, without hesitation, Shadow leapt into the current. The river roared louder, as if trying to swallow both dog and child. Margaret staggered forward, hand over her heart, as the dog cut through the current like a torpedo made of instinct and muscle. His ears flattened, eyes locked on Ellie. Not a soul moved. Time cracked and splintered, just like the shattered teacup on her porch. Margaret couldn't speak, but her soul screamed with everything inside her. Please. Please save her. And Shadow, a dog the world had given up on, charged toward the one life that still believed in him. Rain poured harder, blurring the world into streaks of gray and silver. The wind howled like it shared Margaret's fear, but her eyes never left the water, never left Ellie, and never left the dog now fighting nature itself. Shadow. The chained dog. The town menace. The mistake everyone warned her about. Now, he was her only hope. People began to gather along the embankment, slipping on the muddy slope as word spread that Ellie was in the river. Neighbors shouted. A man pulled out his phone. A woman gasped and clutched her chest. No one moved to help. They just watched. Because in that water was a myth they'd built themselves. A dog they'd once whispered about in grocery store aisles, called unstable after barking at a mailman, dangerous after being seen lunging at a fox in someone's yard. But Shadow didn't care what they said. He swam harder. Every muscle in his body fought the raging current. Water slammed into his chest. His paws vanished beneath the brown churn, but his eyes never wavered. He was locked in, every part of him driven by something deeper than instinct. Ellie's grip had slipped, her small body now drifting like a leaf toward the rapids. Margaret fell to her knees in the mud. Her fingers clawed into the soaked earth, her mouth moved in silent prayer, though no sound came. Her heart felt like it had stopped. Around her, the crowd remained motionless, caught between awe and shame. Someone whispered, "Isn't that Margaret's dog? The one that's supposed to be dangerous?" But what did dangerous look like? Because what they were seeing didn't resemble fear or rage. It looked like resolve. Like loyalty in its rawest, most unshakable form. A scarred body battling the Copperbend River. Eyes that held no panic, only unwavering focus. Shadow surged forward. And then, he vanished beneath the surface. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. The surface churned with waves and debris, but there was no sign of him. No flash of fur. No yellow raincoat. Just water. 1 second. Then 2. Then 3. Time shattered. And then, a burst of gold and black broke through the current. Shadow. In his jaws, Ellie's raincoat. And inside it, the small frame of the girl Margaret loved more than life. Her eyes blinked. She was alive. The entire town stood frozen. Not in fear. In disbelief. Because in that moment, they weren't just watching a rescue, they were witnessing a soul that had every reason to give up on the world, choose to save it instead. Shadow pressed through the water, trembling from exhaustion but steady as ever, dragging Ellie with gentle purpose. He never let her slip. Not even once. And on the bank, Margaret didn't cry out. She didn't fall apart. She simply watched, her heart breaking and healing all at once, as the dog she'd once found broken, returned to her with everything that mattered. And for the first time in years, the people of Willow Creek didn't look at her with doubt. They looked at her and saw something they had forgotten existed. Faith. 1 year earlier, Willow Creek was in the heart of autumn. The trees had turned brilliant shades of copper and crimson, and the air carried that sharp, smoky chill that told you winter wasn't far behind. Most days, Margaret Langley kept to herself. Her little blue cottage sat at the edge of town, just past where the paved road turned to gravel. She liked the quiet. She liked the stillness. But that morning, something felt off. She had been raking leaves near the tree line, her late husband's flannel jacket wrapped tight around her shoulders. The sky was soft gray, the ground damp from an overnight drizzle. She was humming without realizing it, the way she always did when she needed to feel less alone. And then, she heard it. A sound low and strange. Not a growl. Not a whimper. Something in between. Margaret turned toward the trees, toward the edge of the woods where the shadows pooled thickest. At first she saw nothing. Just a swirl of leaves and mist. Then something moved. A dark shape, curled low beneath a blanket of wet foliage. Margaret's breath caught. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a raccoon. It was a dog. He was large, motionless. A German shepherd, or what was left of one. His fur was caked in mud and leaves, and one side of his body bore a deep gash, red and angry beneath the matted hair. His ribs showed. His eyes were half-lidded, distant. He looked like he had given up. Margaret's first instinct wasn't fear. It was sorrow. She stepped closer, slowly, speaking softly even though she doubted he could understand. "Hey there, it's all right." The dog didn't move. But his ears twitched. As she reached him, Margaret noticed a jagged piece of rusted chain still hanging from a collar tied around his neck. The wound on his shoulder wasn't from another animal. It was cleaner. Sharper. Metal. Human. She knelt beside him, careful not to startle him. For a moment, they just sat there, two broken souls under an October sky. "You don't have anyone left, do you?" she whispered. He blinked once. That was enough. Margaret stood, tugged off her flannel, and wrapped it around him. It was too big. Too warm. Too soft for the wilderness. But so was he. She lifted him, gently, awkwardly, and placed him in the back of her pickup truck, on a worn quilt she kept there just in case. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't even know his name. But as she glanced at him through the rearview mirror, she saw something faint behind those tired eyes. Not wildness. Not aggression. Just a flicker of something too tired to fight, but too proud to beg. She called him Shadow, not because he lurked, but because he seemed like a piece of the world the sun had forgotten. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt like maybe, just maybe, she had saved someone. Or maybe, they would save each other. Shadow didn't wag his tail the first night Margaret brought him home. He didn't bark or growl or even make a sound. He lay curled on the corner of the old braided rug by the fireplace, his eyes half closed but never truly sleeping. Every now and then, his body would twitch, some memory playing behind his tired eyes that Margaret couldn't reach. She set out a bowl of water. He didn't touch it. She laid out pieces of cooked chicken, warm and tender. He ignored them. For 2 days, he barely moved. Just breathed. Just watched. Margaret didn't press. She'd been broken once too, when she buried her husband, when the house went quiet, when the days grew long and unbearably silent. She knew the language of grief, stillness, distance, mistrust. So she sat near him. Spoke to him like he was listening, even when he wasn't. She told him about the garden. About her late husband's stubborn roses. About Ellie, her granddaughter, who visited every other weekend and thought hot chocolate could solve every problem. By the 3rd day, the chicken was gone. Shadow didn't let her see him eat, but the bowl was clean when she came back. She smiled for the first time in a while. The weeks passed slowly, like a season learning to trust again. Shadow began to move more, never close, never eager, but with purpose. He'd circle the house each morning, sniffing the door frames, the fence line, the garden shed. He didn't bark when the mailman came, didn't growl at the neighbor's dogs. He simply watched. One afternoon, Margaret found him sitting at the back door, staring into the yard as if waiting for something. Or someone. When Ellie came to visit that weekend, she stopped mid-step on the porch when she saw him. Her eyes lit up, wide with wonder. "Grandma," she whispered, "is that a wolf?" Margaret laughed. "No, honey. He's just different." Ellie, being 6 and fearless, crouched low and whispered, "Hi." Shadow tilted his head. Didn't move. But he didn't back away either. That night, Margaret noticed something odd, Shadow sleeping by Ellie's door. Not close enough to wake her. Just near enough to know if anything happened. The next morning, it was the same. And the next. One day, Ellie tripped in the yard chasing a soccer ball. Shadow, from across the porch, was there in seconds, nose down, body low, circling her like a sentinel. He didn't lick her. Didn't whine. Just stood guard. From that moment on, Margaret understood, this wasn't a pet looking for affection. This was a guardian. A protector without words, trained or not, who had chosen this place as his post. And though he never asked for love, never sought attention, Shadow became something more than company. He became a quiet oath. One she never asked for. But one she came to rely on every single day. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold soil as winter crept into Willow Creek. The first frost came early that year, painting the edges of Margaret's garden with delicate white lace. Inside the cottage, the fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the wooden floor. Shadow lay in his usual spot, near the door, always near the door. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her fingers resting on the edge of her mug. It was late, nearly midnight, and Ellie had already fallen asleep upstairs after one too many marshmallows in her cocoa. Shadow hadn't moved in hours, but she knew he was awake. His ears twitched with every creak of the old house, every shift in the wind. She couldn't sleep. Not because of the cold. Not even because of the memories. Something had been tugging at her, quiet but persistent, like a thread unraveling in the corner of her mind. It was Shadow. There were too many moments she couldn't explain anymore. The way he always stood between Ellie and the front door. How he once found a neighbor's missing cat stuck under their porch just by scent. Or the time he nudged Margaret away from a patch of ice on the driveway, without being called, without even looking back. It wasn't luck. It wasn't random. It was something else. Discipline. Training. Purpose. Margaret pushed her laptop open, the light spilling across the dark kitchen. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Then she began to type. Search and rescue dog behavior. Dozens of articles appeared. She clicked through them, eyes scanning quickly. Alert posture. Scent tracking. Victim response. Focus under duress. Command recognition. Everything she read felt familiar, like watching a stranger describe the dog sleeping 10 feet away from her. Then she found a video. A German shepherd, sleek and alert, maneuvering through a disaster drill. It sniffed the ground in slow, careful arcs, responding to hand signals, locating a hidden victim beneath rubble. Margaret's breath caught. It was exactly how Shadow moved when he swept the hallway that morning after Ellie spilled juice and blamed the dog. No sniffing around like a normal pup. Just a calculated, silent search. She turned slowly. Shadow was still lying beneath the coat rack, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Shadow, she said gently, barely above a whisper. Search. He didn't bark. Didn't whine. Just lifted his head, stood slowly, and lowered his nose to the floor. And then, he began to move. Back and forth, in a deliberate sweep across the kitchen. No excitement, no tail wag. Just methodical precision. Margaret's heart pounded. She stepped back, watching in stunned silence. This wasn't a stray. This wasn't a backyard dog or a misunderstood mutt. This was a professional. A working dog. Trained to save lives. And yet, someone had left him for dead. The question now wasn't what Shadow was. It was who had he been, and why did they let him go? The next morning, the cold clung to the windows like breath held too long. Margaret hadn't slept. Not really. She had spent the night pacing between the laptop and the fire, replaying the image of Shadow sweeping the kitchen like it was a collapsed building and Ellie was buried beneath it. Her mug of coffee had gone cold twice before she finally typed the words that had been circling her thoughts all night. Missing search and rescue dog, Oregon, German shepherd. Dozens of results popped up, training centers, adoption sites, local K9 stories, but one headline near the bottom caught her eye. It was from 2 years ago. The article was short, barely 100 words, tucked between town budget meetings and holiday closures. Rescue dog missing after Ridgeway flood mission, presumed dead. Her stomach dropped. She clicked. The article described a search and rescue operation during a historic flash flood in Ridgeway County, just 70 miles from Willow Creek. A teenage boy had gone missing after a landslide. A team of responders and K9 units had been dispatched. Among them was a German shepherd named Ranger, part of the Ridgeway Emergency Response Unit. According to the report, Ranger had picked up the boy's scent and led the team into unstable terrain. But during the operation, a secondary collapse buried part of the trail. Ranger ran ahead, into the danger zone, and never came back. His handler filed a death report. His body was never recovered. The name of the reporting officer made Margaret sit straight in her chair. Sheriff Travis Monroe. Her heart stuttered. Travis had only been sheriff in Willow Creek for a little over a year. Before that, he served in Ridgway County's disaster response unit. He was respected, polished, always the first to volunteer at the town hall meetings and holiday food drives, and the loudest voice to warn Margaret not to trust that dog. Some animals can't be fixed, he had once told her. It's best to keep him away from others. Her eyes narrowed. She scrolled down to the final lines of the article. Ranger, 4 years old. Black and tan German Shepherd. Noted for precision tracking. Distinctive scar on right shoulder. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Shadow, no, Ranger, had that scar. Same breed. Same age. Same instincts. Same soul. There was no doubt now. Shadow was Ranger. Which meant Sheriff Monroe hadn't just been wrong. He had lied. He hadn't lost a dog in the line of duty. He had abandoned one. Declared him dead. Buried the truth under official paperwork and silence. And if he'd gone that far to hide it, the real question wasn't what had happened that day. It was why. Margaret closed the laptop slowly, her reflection staring back at her in the black screen. There was a truth this town had forgotten. And a hero it had discarded. But not anymore. The storm rolled in fast, swallowing the sky above Willow Creek in a matter of hours. What had started as a whisper of drizzle turned into a wall of water pounding against rooftops and windows. Margaret stood by the front window, hands curled around the edges of the curtain, watching the trees sway like frightened dancers. Local radio buzzed with emergency alerts, flooding along Copperbend River, road closures, evacuations. But none of that mattered the moment she saw the back door wide open. She hadn't heard it in the wind. Hadn't noticed in her worry. Her heart stopped. The kitchen floor was speckled with muddy footprints, small ones. Ellie, she called, already moving. No answer. She ran into the yard, rain slashing her cheeks, hair plastered to her forehead. She screamed again, louder this time, into the roaring dark. Then, she saw it. The yellow raincoat. The same one Ellie had worn a year ago. The one Shadow had pulled from the river like a trophy of survival. Now it floated, again, caught in the violent swirl of Copperbend River, and Ellie was in the water. The flood had reached the lower yard, carving a muddy path down to the riverbank. Ellie must have followed the sound of the water, curious, innocent. And now she was caught in the current, arms flailing, her tiny face barely above the surface. Margaret's knees buckled. But before she could scream, Shadow was already moving. From the side of the house, the German Shepherd bolted like lightning, no hesitation, no pause for instruction. His body, still recovering from the last flood, moved with painful determination. Stitches tugged beneath his fur. His legs trembled with the strain of old wounds. But he didn't stop. Margaret screamed his name, but it didn't matter. He was gone, charging through mud and water, straight toward the edge. And then, without breaking stride, he leapt. The river swallowed him whole. Margaret collapsed at the base of the slope, rain pouring down her face like tears she didn't have time to cry. There was no crowd this time. No witnesses. Just her and the storm and two souls fighting a current that showed no mercy. The rain blurred everything, trees, sky, memory. And then, from the edge of the woods, a figure emerged. A man. Drenched. Silent. Sheriff Travis Monroe. Their eyes met, hers wild with terror, his frozen with something else. Recognition. Regret. And then, without a word, he ran. Not as sheriff. Not as a symbol. As a man chasing the only thing he'd ever truly abandoned. He reached the riverbank just as Shadow surfaced again, Ellie's raincoat clenched between his teeth. Travis dove into the water, grabbing the girl, pulling her close. Margaret watched, barely breathing, as the two figures, one man and one dog, fought side by side against the current. And for the second time in his life, Ranger chose not to turn away. Not even from the man who had once left him behind. The fluorescent lights of Willow Creek Veterinary Hospital buzzed softly above cold plastic chairs. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet fur. The storm had passed, but inside, the tension still clung to the air like static. Margaret sat motionless, her hands wrapped tightly around a foam cup of lukewarm coffee. Across from her, Travis Monroe leaned forward, elbows on knees, head down. His uniform was soaked through, stained with mud and river water. Neither of them had spoken in over 30 minutes. In the back room, Shadow, Ranger, was fighting for his life. Through the swinging emergency door, Margaret had glimpsed him once, laid out on a metal table, chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths, fur matted with blood and river silt. The vet worked silently, focus etched into every movement. Machines beeped quietly, and Shadow didn't move. Margaret tightened her grip on the cup. Her knuckles had gone white. Finally, Travis broke the silence. "I knew it was him," he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "The second I saw him again. I knew." Margaret didn't look up. Her voice came low, steady. "Then why didn't you say anything?" Travis swallowed hard. "Because if I did, I'd have to admit what I did to him." The words hung there, heavy. He looked at her, eyes red for more than just exhaustion. 2 years ago, during the Ridgeway flood, Ranger picked up a scent, a teenage boy trapped in a collapsed cabin. He kept trying to pull me in one direction. I didn't trust it. I thought he was wrong. It didn't make sense with the reports. He paused, jaw tightening. So I made the call. We left. 2 days later, they found the boy's body, exactly where Ranger had tried to lead us. Margaret finally met his eyes. Travis's voice cracked. I couldn't face it. I couldn't look anyone in the eye. Especially him. So I wrote the report, said he'd gone missing in the landslide. Then I drove him out into the woods, unhooked his leash, and left. Margaret's breath hitched, a small sound full of disbelief and quiet rage. I thought that would be the end of it, Travis continued. But he came back. To this town. To you. And even after everything I did, he still saved my life tonight. Saved that little girl again. He rubbed his face with trembling hands. He forgave me. I don't understand it. Margaret's eyes shimmered, not with anger, but with sorrow. Because he's better than we are, she whispered. He doesn't care what you did. He just cares that you came back. Travis nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. If he makes it through this, I won't run again. They sat in silence, not as sheriff and citizen, not as strangers, just two people waiting in the cold glow of consequence and hope. Beyond the closed door, Shadow fought for breath. And inside both of them, something long buried began to stir. A need to make things right. Morning crept into Willow Creek beneath a sky still bruised by the storm. Light filtered through thinning clouds, casting soft golden rays across the parking lot of the veterinary hospital. Inside, the waiting room had grown quiet again. Margaret stood by the window, arms crossed, her fingers tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. The cup of coffee she'd held all night sat abandoned on a side table, cold and untouched. Travis Monroe sat beside her, a worn folder resting on his lap. It was thin, but what it contained weighed more than a courtroom's worth of evidence. Reports. Photos. Missing documents. The things he never turned in. The pieces of truth he'd buried. Margaret didn't look at him as she spoke. If you truly want to make this right, don't apologize to me. Travis turned toward her. Then who? Everyone, she said. This town. The people who signed the petition to have him put down. The ones who believed the rumors you started. His jaw tightened. They won't believe me. They don't need to believe you, Margaret said, turning to face him. They need to see you. Hear the truth. Not from a sheriff. From a man who lost his way and had the guts to come back. Travis exhaled, long and slow, like he was deflating under the weight of years he hadn't let himself feel. You think that's enough? No, Margaret said. But it's a start. He nodded, quiet, and opened the folder in his lap. Inside were the old mission logs from Ridgway County's emergency unit. One photo slipped loose and fluttered to the floor. He picked it up slowly. A younger Travis stood in uniform, a proud smile on his face. Beside him, wearing a search and rescue vest, was Ranger, eyes alert, stance strong, tail curled in attention. It hurt to look at it now. Margaret watched as he gently placed the photo on the table, then reached for her laptop. They sat side by side, the old machine whirring to life. Together, they began compiling everything. The truth, piece by piece. Margaret spoke softly as she typed. We'll hold a public forum. At the Civic Hall. No excuses. No uniforms. Just the truth. Travis nodded. I'll do it. They worked in silence, but it wasn't cold anymore. It felt like building something out of rubble. Redemption had no script. But it had witnesses. Hours later, as the sun broke fully through the clouds, a soft knock came at the waiting room door. The vet stepped out, pulling off his gloves. He's stable, he said, offering a tired smile. Weak, but he's breathing on his own. He made it. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Her knees nearly buckled. Travis sat back in the chair, eyes glistening, hands covering his face. Shadow, Ranger, had survived. The town didn't know it yet, but the soul they once tried to erase had just taken his first breath in a new chapter. And this time, the truth would be there to meet him. The doors of Willow Creek Civic Hall creaked open just after 6 in the evening. Rain still lingered in the gutters, dripping steadily, as if the town itself hadn't quite finished crying. Inside, the old wooden benches filled quickly with residents, familiar faces, tired eyes, folded arms. There was no music, no pledge, no ceremony. Just the hum of whispered speculation. They'd all heard by now. Something about Sheriff Monroe. Something about that dog. No one knew the full story, but everyone came. Margaret sat quietly near the front, her hands folded in her lap, Ellie beside her, clutching the stuffed bear Shadow had once nosed back to her from the garden. The child's other hand rested on the back of the large German shepherd lying at their feet. Shadow, or rather, Ranger. His body was still weak, wrapped gently in bandages. But his eyes were open. Watching. The room dimmed as the lights were lowered. A projector flickered to life. But there were no slides. No dramatic videos. Just a podium. A microphone. And then, Margaret Langley stood up. She walked slowly to the front, the quiet tapping of her shoes echoing like a heartbeat. I'm not here to give a speech, she began, her voice soft but steady. I'm here because a little girl almost died. Twice. The room fell still. And both times, she continued, a dog this town called dangerous, this town wanted put down, chose to save her. She glanced back at Ranger, lying at Ellie's feet. I used to believe only people were capable of sacrifice, she said, her voice trembling now. Until I watched a scarred, abandoned dog hurl himself into a raging river. Not once. But twice. And never asked for anything in return. She paused, scanning the room. He didn't do it because he was told to. He did it because that's who he is. Loyal. Brave. Good. Then, without another word, she stepped down and took her seat. All eyes shifted to the next figure rising from the side of the room. Sheriff Travis Monroe. He wore no badge, no gun, no uniform. Just a plain shirt and a weathered folder in his hands. "I won't take much of your time," he said quietly. "Because I don't deserve it." He opened the folder and pulled out the photo. Him and Ranger. Before. This was my partner. His name was Ranger. 2 years ago, during a rescue mission, he tried to lead me to a missing boy. I ignored him. I left him behind. And I lied. Gasps rippled through the room. I said he died. I filed the report. Then I dumped him in the woods because I couldn't live with the truth. He looked down. But he survived. And then he came back. And even after everything I did, he still saved lives. He turned to Ranger. I made the wrong choice. Then looked back at the crowd. But tonight, I choose truth. Silence. Then, one clap. Then another. And then, the room erupted. Not just for a dog who saved a child, but for a dog who saved them all. 1 month later, the town of Willow Creek stood beneath a gentler sky. The last of the floodwater had receded, leaving behind fresh silt, uprooted fences, and a town forever changed. But it wasn't the damage that lingered, it was the memory of what they had seen. What they had ignored. And who they had nearly lost. Just outside the Willow Creek Sheriff's Office, a small wooden structure had been built beside the main flagpole. Its roof was painted deep forest green. Fresh flowers lined the path leading up to it. Children whispered as they approached, parents walking quietly beside them. At the center stood a bronze plaque, newly installed, glinting under the early morning sun. Willow Creek Rescue Unit, Honorary Division. In recognition of unwavering courage and selfless service. First member, Ranger. Formerly known as Shadow. There was no long speech. No national anthem. Just a pair of scissors held in the small hands of a little girl wearing a white dress. Ellie. Her smile stretched from ear to ear as she stood proudly beside the German Shepherd who had saved her life, twice. His coat had regained its shine. The scars on his body, though still visible, no longer spoke of pain. They spoke of strength. Of survival. Ranger stood calmly beside her, a special harness across his back with a patch that read Guardian. The ribbon fluttered, then fell. Cheers and clapping followed, but it wasn't the loud celebration that mattered. It was what came next. People began to walk up, not with fear, not with judgment, but with cookies. Children placed them gently at the edge of the fence, where Ranger used to lie, alone and chained. Now, that spot had been turned into a small garden. A place of peace. A symbol of change. Margaret stood near the back of the crowd, a tissue in her hand, though her smile said more than any tear could. Every time Ellie tossed the tennis ball into the grass, Ranger chased it, not with the energy of a pup, but with the joy of someone who had finally found their place in the world. Across the street, standing near the sidewalk, Travis Monroe watched silently. He wore no uniform. No badge. Just a simple jacket and a worn ball cap. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. Because when Ranger turned and locked eyes with him, just for a moment, Travis gave the smallest of nods. And Ranger, with a slow wag of his tail, acknowledged it. It wasn't forgiveness. It was understanding. And sometimes, that was enough. As the sun dipped toward the trees, casting a golden light over the lawn, Margaret stepped onto the porch, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. Ellie sat beside Ranger on the grass, her tiny hand resting on his back. His ears twitched as he lay beside her, calm and content. And in that moment, the past no longer defined them. It had simply led them here. To the beginning of something better. The porch of 42 Cedar Trail creaked softly beneath Margaret's old rocking chair. The air smelled of pine and warm soil, the last golden strands of sunset slipping behind the tree line. Spring had come early, brushing the hills of Willow Creek with fresh green. On the porch beside her, a steaming mug of tea rested on the railing, untouched. She didn't need it. What she needed, what she had, was right in front of her. Ellie, curled in a blanket, her head resting against Margaret's side, legs swinging softly beneath the chair. And Ranger, stretched out at their feet, his body still, his breathing slow and calm. One ear twitched every now and then, catching the sound of crickets or the distant chirp of a bird returning home. He wasn't guarding anymore. Not tonight. Tonight, he was simply home. Margaret reached down and ran her fingers gently over the thick fur at the back of his neck. His eyes fluttered open for just a moment. That deep amber gaze, clearer now, brighter, met hers. And for the first time, she saw no shadow there. Just peace. You know, she whispered, more to herself than anyone, there were days I thought I'd never feel safe again. After Henry passed, after the silence settled in. I thought that was the end of good things. Ellie stirred beside her but didn't speak. She didn't need to. Children somehow understood the things adults couldn't say aloud. Margaret looked out toward the fading horizon, the soft hum of cicadas filling the stillness. But you, she said, glancing down at Ranger, you reminded me that even broken things still have something to give. Ranger didn't move. Just let out a soft breath through his nose, like a quiet exhale of agreement. Across the yard, Travis Monroe stood leaning against his pickup truck. He hadn't come up the steps. He never did. But he showed up every few days, helped patch the shed, brought bags of dog food, left before the conversations got too long. Margaret nodded to him. He nodded back. Sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand apologies or applause. Sometimes it comes in showing up anyway. As the last rays of daylight slipped behind the trees, Ellie reached down, her little hand brushing against Ranger's fur. "Grandma," she murmured. "Yes, sweetheart? Do you think he knows?" Margaret looked down at the dog, the one who had been abandoned, forgotten, feared, and who had chosen to save instead of hate. "I think he always knew," she said softly. "He just needed someone to believe in him." She placed her hand gently on Ranger's head. "Everyone needs someone to believe in them, Ellie. Just one person. That's all it takes." Ranger closed his eyes, his breathing even, his body perfectly still, except for the slow, steady wag of his tail. And in that moment, beneath the warm porch light and the hush of an Oregon twilight, three souls sat in silence. Not alone. Not broken. Just whole. Together.